ambivalence in Montenegro, that these divisions, again because of the fundamental ambivalence, had the ability to, so you find families in which somebody would declare themselves to be of Serb identity and somebody to declare themselves of Montenegrin identity. Even in the case of Slobodan Milosevic, Milosevic declared himself to be a Serb, but Montenegro was, in Serbia were two eyes in the same head, but his brother has always described himself as a Montenegrin. We have this now in Montenegro with, I think we were talking about it earlier, with the Tadic, Milka Tadic, the journalist who is editor of Monitor, and he was very, very a great advocate of Montenegrin independence, while her cousin Boris Tadic is, as we know, president of Serbia. So here you have these divisions between the Greens and the Whites. The Whites largely coming, as I was saying, from parts of Serbia, parts of Montenegro adjoining Serbia. There were atrocities committed by both sides, compounded by famine. It was really a very, very harsh and difficult time in Montenegro. Both sides, rebels and Whites and Greens, plundered and really wreaked havoc on the countryside. So that when the Whites finally triumphed in the mid-1920s, the divisions that had been created by this period of fighting did not really disappear. Again, in the words of Ivo Banac, they remained as permanent fixtures in the Montenegrin political landscape. So the turmoil of this period threw the difficult question of Montenegrin identity and loyalties into sharp relief. Once an inspiring motherland, Serbia had eclipsed Montenegro's existence as an independent state. Many Montenegrins, and not only those Montenegrins who were supporters of the Petrovic dynasty, were affronted by the way in which unification had been achieved and imposed upon them by Serbs, without respect for Montenegro's traditions and historical identity. To make matters worse, the treatment meted out to Montenegro during these bleak interwar years, the years between the First and Second World War, which range from economic neglect and the abolition of the effectively autocephalous Montenegrin church to the elimination of the country's historic name. It became known in the period from 1929 as the Zetska Banovina. This treatment was designed to obliterate all the traces of the independent Montenegro, of its former statehood, and to work to reduce and diminish and obliterate differences between Serbia and Montenegro. Well, the Second World War was a very strong contrast to this period, because the traumatic events of that period refocused attention on Montenegro. Occupied by the Italians in 1941 after Yugoslavia's capitulation to the Axis powers, the country was soon involved in a bitter civil war between Tito's communist partisans and the Chetniks loyal to King Peter of Serbia. And here again, at this time, identity issues came to the fore, at times cutting across previous divisions over identity. So you had the previous divisions, and then you had these new divisions. Sometimes they overlapped and reinforced each other, but sometimes they cut across one another. By and large, though, traditionally pro-Serbia areas, those of the Vasojevici tribe, for example, around the Lim River and around Berane, tended to support the Serbian royalists, while the partisans, despite the fact they took Montenegrins of all backgrounds and tendencies, they took people, they took Croatians and some Albanians. The partisans at this stage tended to emphasize Montenegrin identity, Montenegro as a separate nation, simply out of reaction to the Chetniks. This was not the official view of the communists, and certainly not of Milovan Djilas later, but there was nevertheless at this time consolidating and building up of the idea of the Montenegrins as a separate nation. Throughout the war, as again everybody here I'm sure knows that the fighting in Montenegro was exceptionally savage, and the Montenegrins played a prominent part, perhaps no doubt aided by their long traditions of guerrilla warfare, which made them particularly valued recruits for the partisans. It was really in recognition, well, for a number of reasons, but partly in recognition of this, that after the war, Tito made Montenegro a full republic of the then Federal People's Republic of Yugoslavia. At the same time, Montenegro's borders were extended to take in the area around the Bay of Kotor, which was, of course, an extremely valuable addition to the Republic of Montenegro, but also brought in a lot of people who were Catholics and who identified themselves as Croats. And at the same time, Montenegro, at the same time as this rearrangement, of course, Montenegro ceded some of the territory it had previously gained in Kosovo, around Jakovo. Well, for many Montenegrins, and I think this is interesting and significant, many Montenegrins, the creation of a separate Republic of Montenegro managed to square the circle, if you like, of Montenegrin identity, to resolve the conundrum in some sort of satisfactory way. Because on the one hand, the sort of quasi-statehood of Montenegro at this time, its existence as a republic, helped to assuage the patriotic feelings of those who wished to see Montenegro as an independent actor on the political stage. On the other hand, it provided membership of a common state in which they were together with Serbia, so that they were, for those who wished to see themselves as Serbs, they also were able to find a sense of accommodation under the Republic of Montenegro, a period of Tito. And you see in Montenegro still, I think, among older people, a great nostalgia for the Tito period among an older generation. In terms of identity, this state of affairs engendered a widespread willingness for Montenegrins to see themselves as possessing a dual identity, so being once Montenegrin and Serb, at the same time, for many of them Montenegrin and Yugoslav. This was a satisfactory way of dealing with this very difficult conundrum. Writing about this time, indeed, the Montenegrin political analyst Srđan Demanović has described the condition of the Montenegrin as a national honor duplex, a victim of his double divided consciousness. So you have a very strange situation where people could have a sense of double identity, one Serb, Montenegrin, and Yugoslav, or a divided identity. Well, Tito's split with Stalin in 1948 severely dented this happy relationship with Tito's Yugoslavia for a period when a disproportionate number of Montenegrins were shipped off to gulags, like Goliotok, off the Montenegrin coast, when these Montenegrins proved unable to renounce the affection they had for Russia and the concomitant commitment to Stalin's hardline approach. Montenegro had the highest membership per head of population of the Communist Party at this point, but the pro-Russian sentiments of Montenegro had made Montenegrins particularly, again, feel this sentiment with Russia and therefore unable to adapt when in 1948 they had to announce Stalin's Russia. But leaving this period aside, which was a dark period in Montenegro's history, overall the Tito period, I think one could say, was a contented time for most Montenegrins who benefited substantially from Tito's determination to invest heavily in the smaller and more economically disadvantaged republics, and also Tito's desire to build up the smaller republics, in a sense, to balance and cut down the two, Serbia and Croatia. So while this caused considerable satisfaction in Montenegro, needless to say, it caused dissatisfaction in both Serbia and to some degree Croatia. Montenegrins, again, like Serbs, were heavily overrepresented in the Yugoslav armed forces, especially in the officer class, and they played a very considerable part, if one thinks back, in the state apparatus. I think it's very clear that people who remember this period see how many Montenegrins very ably inserted themselves into the state apparatus. I think there was even a saying at the time saying Montenegro has come to Dedinje in Belgrade, when they had sort of suddenly moved into this very luxurious area of Belgrade. Well, this ability of Montenegrins to punch above their weight in old Yugoslavia caused some resentment from other Yugoslavs, including Serbs. And in the way of what happened so generally in the former Yugoslavia, there were attempts to depict Montenegrins in certain cultural stereotypes, negative stereotypes, lazy, vain, misogynist. But on the other hand, another whole lot of stereotypes also existed, which depicted Montenegrins as courageous, intelligent, proud. And I always thought when I was living in Belgrade, and there was a sort of great tendency to sort of discount any kind of separateness in Montenegro. Montenegrins. It was very interesting. At the same time, the same people who were telling you that would immediately proceed to characterize Montenegrins by a set of stereotypes, which struck me as inherently contradictory. Well, despite this period of prosperity and heavy investment, Montenegro, like everywhere else in the former Yugoslavia, experienced its share of, very considerable share of economic woes at the end of the 1980s, when the collapse of communism and the economic problems, the deluge of economic problems in Tito's Yugoslavia brought the former Yugoslavia really to its knees. I won't go in now to describing the state of economic disintegration and discontent, levels of unemployment in Montenegro, but suffice it to say that this created an atmosphere of discontent, in which it was much easier, I think one would say, for Milosevic to play the nationalist card in Montenegro and to heighten fears whipped up by Serbian nationalists about alleged, but of course unsubstantiated, mistreatment of Serbs by Albanians in Kosovo. So this nationalist card was strongly played in 1989 in Montenegro, and in Montenegro, as in Vojvodina, the so-called anti-bureaucratic revolutions were engineered by Milosevic's henchmen, overthrowing the weary old communist regime and replacing them with new personalities. Prominent among these new personalities was, of course, the 29-year-old Milo Djukanovic, who was at first an enthusiast for Milosevic's policies. And despite attempts now to airbrush this very much from Montenegrin political memory at that time, Djukanovic was prominent among those who made statements whipping up anti-Croat sentiments during the 1990 war with Croatia, when Montenegrin forces attacked and ravaged the Croatian countryside, and the attacks on Dubrovnik, the bombardment of Dubrovnik, which those of us, older members of us, remember very well from television reports at the time. Still in this atmosphere in 1992,